of his talk today is actually the new developments in the academic study of Islam and Muslim societies. A review of the past 2 decades. A review of the past 2 decades. I will make a very short introduction to Dr. Aria background. He is currently an assistant professor of Islamic Studies and Anthropology at Washington University, St. Louis. He holds a joint PhD in Anthropology and Middle Eastern Studies from Harvard, and also he has a JD, Juris Doctor degree, and from Harvard as well. And he has a master degree in Islamic law from the International Islamic University, Malaysia. Dr. Nakissa is actually working in multidisciplinary studies across many disciplines. So he is working extensively in ethnographic field work in Middle East and Southeast Asia. And at the same time, he is also conducting work on the cognitive science of religion and study of Islam and biology and many cross disciplines. And he is dedicating all of them to the study of the Muslim society and Islam. He published many papers in well-reputed journals, and he published a book with Oxford University Press. His book title was The Anthropology of Islamic Law, Education, Ethics, and Legal Interpretation at Egypt's Al-Azhar. And this is a very well-known book currently in this area and well-reviewed by many. Without further delay, I would like to invite Dr. Aria to deliver his talk, and it will be for about maybe 50 minutes or so. And then after this, we will open for questions and answers. And I hope anybody who has a question during the lecture, he can post the question on the chat box so we can answer it at the end of the lecture. Thank you very much, Dr. Aria, please.
Merit attention. The first development involves the first development involves I'm sorry. Hello? The first development involves efforts to provide a new account of early Islamic history based on a much wider range of evidentiary sources. Sources including rock inscriptions from across Arabia, Greek, Syriac, and Pahlavi text, as well as archaeological and bioarchaeological discoveries. The second development that I will discuss consists in the use of cognitive science to understand the biologically rooted psychological foundations of Muslim religiosity and social behavior more generally. The third development consists in the use of data science and socioeconomic statistics to understand Muslim societies. The fourth development consists in the use of data science to understand Muslim cultural artifacts like texts, photos, videos, and so on. In this presentation, I briefly address the 4 preceding developments and consider their implications for the future study of Islam and Muslim societies. So let's begin with the first development, which relates to rethinking the study of early Islam. The Western academic field of Islamic studies is traditionally focused on a corpus of Arabic language writings produced by Muslim scholars. These writings include texts like tafsir works, hadith compilations, fiqh manuals, theological treatises, military histories, and biographical dictionaries. Texts of this kind frequently claim to preserve accurate information from the lifetime of the Prophet Muhammad and the centuries immediately following his death. However, Western scholars have long voiced skepticism about such claims. Many Western scholars hold that in reality, there are very few Muslim writings which can be dated without doubt to the first two Islamic centuries, i.e. the 7th and 8th century CE. Consider, for instance, the earliest major works of Sirah, Tafsir, Hadith, and Fiqh, which have been passed down onto us. These include Sirah works like those of Ibn Ishaq and Musa bin Uqba, the Tafsir of Muqatil bin Sulaiman, and the Hadith works of figures like Malik, Abdul Razak, and Ibn Abi Shayba. Such works were composed 1 to 2 centuries after the Prophet's death. To be sure, it is claimed that these works are based on earlier or written sources, yet claims of this type are not immune to criticism. Every major religious tradition that exists today claims that its core religious texts have been transmitted unchanged from some authoritative figure. This is true of Judaism, Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism, Confucianism, and Taoism. For instance, in Judaism, parts of the Hebrew Bible are attributed to Moses. In Christianity, parts of the New Testament are attributed to Jesus, like his sayings in the Gospels. Nevertheless, since the 19th century, it has been recognized that such attributions are largely or entirely false. Hence, if we rely exclusively on scientific historical methods, it is not possible to establish that Moses existed, and it is difficult to establish much about the teachings of Jesus. Teachings and texts attributed to Moses and Jesus in the Christian and Jewish traditions were created by others, often many centuries after Moses and Jesus were supposed to have lived. Similar discoveries have been made with respect to other major religions like Buddhism and Taoism. Islam would be highly exceptional were it possible to prove not only that its founder Muhammad existed, but also that texts and teachings associated with its founder had been preserved over time. So this brings us to the question, is Islam exceptional? Since the 19th century, most scholars have conceded, either implicitly or explicitly, that Islam is at least somewhat exceptional. Consider the great 19th century Orientalists Ernest Renan and Julius Wellhausen. These figures acquired deep expertise in the three religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. They held that it was difficult or impossible to attribute basic Jewish and Christian teachings to Moses and Jesus. By contrast, it is possible to attribute basic Islamic teachings to Muhammad. At the same time, Western scholars have adopted a more skeptical stance towards the Islamic tradition than pre-modern Muslim scholars. And indeed, since the 1970s, a radical form of skepticism emerged among Western scholars, often labeled revisionism. Revisionists have challenged virtually every assumption about the first 2 centuries of Islamic history. For instance, they have cast doubt on the existence of Muhammad and argued that even if the Prophet existed, the Quran was actually created long after his death. Perhaps the Quranic text, according to them, evolved over the course of a century or more. Here, revisionists are suggesting that the historical origins of Islam are as problematic as those of other religious traditions like Judaism, Christianity, Buddhism, and so on. In other words, revisionists are challenging the view, standard even in Western scholarship, that Islam is exceptional. Within Western academia, most scholars have not accepted the most radical revisionist claims. Nevertheless, revisionism has had a major impact on recent scholarship concerning Islam's origins. Hence, at this point, it is widely accepted that Arabic texts written by Muslims taken alone are not adequate as sources for reconstructing the earliest Islamic history. Rather, other sources are necessary. And since the 1970s, scholars have begun to collect together as many of these sources as possible. And this process is only accelerated over the past 2 decades. So what other sources are there? Here, I will briefly mention 3 sources that are particularly important. The first source consists in Arabic or Proto-Arabic writings, which can securely be dated to sometime before 800 CE. In order for a writing to be securely dated, it must exist in its original form and cannot be a copy. For instance, a text of the Quran can be securely dated to the year 1500 if it is written on a piece of parchment made in 1500 CE, as determined by radiocarbon dating. Similarly, if you have a Quranic text written on a piece of parchment made in 700 CE, then it can be securely dated to 700 CE. Securely dated texts take many different forms. They are inscribed on parchment, papyri, coins, building walls, and rocks, for instance, graffiti. Here there have been many important discoveries. One of the most important discoveries is that the Quran actually can be dated to the life of Muhammad and did not undergo significant changes after his death, which was shocking to many individuals. Precisely because it is this would be so exceptional in human religious history. And this has been established by radiocarbon dating, for instance, of the Birmingham Manuscript. It has also been corroborated by paleographic and stylographic analyses. This fact alone establishes that the Islamic tradition is at least to some significant extent exceptional, and that the Quran is different from scriptural texts like the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, the Tripitaka, the Vedas, and the Tao Te Ching. Recent decades have also witnessed the discovery of thousands of rock inscriptions in northern Arabia and the Hijaz. Many of these inscriptions date from the first 2 centuries of Islam and definitively establish the existence of particular persons and historical events. For instance, they not only establish the existence of the Prophet Muhammad, but also that he had a wife named Aisha, and for instance, that there was a caliph named Uthman who was assassinated. The inscriptions further demonstrate that the earliest Muslims had created a Hijri calendar and were using it to precisely mark dates, like the assassination of Omar in the year 24 Hijri. Although all of this may seem unremarkable, it should be noted that in other major religious traditions, it is usually difficult or impossible to definitively establish the existence of early persons or events. For instance, events tied to the lives of, let's say, Moses or Buddha or Lao Tzu. Some of the most important rock inscriptions which have been discovered date to the period before the life of the Prophet, providing new insights into the nature of pre-Islamic Arabian religion and culture. This is important for understanding early Islamic teachings, for these teachings addressed, critiqued, and reformed elements of pre-Islamic religion and culture, such as, let's say, Hajj rituals and marital norms. Let us now move to a second source for early Islamic history that has received more attention in recent decades. This source includes non-Arabic writings which can be dated before 800 CE. Such writings were produced in languages like Greek, Syriac, and Pahlavi by non-Muslim populations. These writings discuss early Muslim religious teachings as well as historical events involving the earliest Muslims. For instance, there are Syriac and Greek Christian texts which mention Muhammad within a decade of his death, like the fragment on the Arab conquests. Or the Doctrina Jacobi. There are also non-Arabic, non-Muslim texts which date to the period immediately before the Prophet's mission, which provide important historical context for understanding the rise of Islam and the early Islamic conquests. It is now widely accepted that the rise of Islam should be situated in relation to the world of late antiquity. The world of late antiquity encompasses the Middle Eastern and Mediterranean regions between the 3rd and 8th centuries CE. During this period, the regions were linked culturally and religiously and were initially dominated by the neighboring Byzantine and Sasanian empires. Prior to the rise of Islam, the major religions of the late antique world were Judaism, Christianity, Zoroastrianism, and Manichaeism. These religions all shared a number of key doctrines. These included belief in one supreme being or God, like Yahweh, Ahura Mazda, belief that God usually communicates his teachings through revelation given to prophets or messengers or apostles, so Moses, Zoroaster, Paul, or Mani, belief that divine revelation is preserved in the form of scriptural texts, so for instance, the Avesta, the Hebrew Bible, the Manichaean Heptateuch, belief in an afterlife where people are recompensed for their good and bad deeds, and belief in a coming end of the world where the forces of good triumph over the forces of evil. Islam endorses similar beliefs, which is one major reason why so many people in the late antique world were prepared to convert to Islam. Given that Islam is so closely related to other late antique religions, understanding the rise of Islam requires studying contemporaneous textual material associated with these other religions. We now come to the third source for early Islamic history. This source consists in non-written material evidence. Thus, in recent decades, Western scholars of early Islam have increasingly relied on archaeological evidence drawn from artifacts and buildings. Such material evidence can tell us many different things and can help us confirm the existence of particular teachings and practices. For example, suppose we find an early mosque, and this mosque is oriented towards Mecca. It contains water basins and lacks images. Such a mosque provides material evidence confirming early Islamic teachings like prayer towards Mecca, prayer ablutions, and a prohibition on images. A newer and potentially more informative type of material evidence consists in bioarchaeological evidence drawn from the remains of humans, animals, and plants. Thus, animal remains can tell us about early Muslim practices related to sacrifice, slaughter, and diet. The analysis of human bones provides information about what early Muslims ate, how long they lived, what kind of diseases they suffered for, and the prevalence of war or violent death. The analysis of DNA extracted from bones, for instance, paleogenetics, offers even more information. Extracted DNA enables us to date and track population migrations, estimate the size of Muslim populations, track particular kinship structures related to levels of kind of blood relatedness, track mating patterns, and track dietary patterns. To sum up, particularly as a response to the revisionist currents which emerged in the 1970s, recent decades have seen increasingly systematic attempts to gather myriad sources of evidence on early Islamic history. These sources of evidence can be used to confirm or revise conventional accounts of early Islamic history. They also reflect on the long-standing question of whether and to what extent Islam is exceptional. In my view, current research provides four major pieces of evidence which suggest that Islam has indeed been exceptional when it comes to preserving early religious teachings. These are preservation of the Quranic text, that's one central piece of evidence, the immediate establishment of a new Hijri dating system, which we see through rock inscriptions, to precisely mark events, a verifiable, accurate chronology of early historical events. So for instance, prior to these rock inscriptions, someone might say, oh, well, Islamic texts mentioned that there was a caliph named Uthman, but perhaps this was an idea that came about later. But now that we have contemporary rock inscriptions, we can say that early Islamic history, the events that it records are actually verifiable historical events. And then finally, in addition to that verifiable, accurate chronology of early historical events, we have the fact that the early Muslims created an unprecedented system of isnad criticism accompanied by systematic biographical dictionaries. So all of these are important and important developments that are reconfiguring people's understanding of early Islamic history. Let me now move on to the second development that is shaping the study of Islam and Muslim societies. And this relates to cognitive science as an approach to Islamic studies. Conventional research in the humanities and social sciences operates with a particular understanding of human behavior. It is based on the work of social philosophers such as Weber, Durkheim, Marx, or more recently, Geertz, Foucault, and Bourdieu. These social philosophers do not situate human behavior in relationship to evolutionary biology or biologically rooted psychology. This state of affairs has deeply affected Western research on Islam and Muslim societies. Hence, such research does not situate Muslim thought and behavior in relationship to biology or biologically rooted psychology. Nevertheless, over the past 3 decades, scholars have increasingly sought to challenge conventional research in the humanities and the social sciences. Thus, biologists, psychologists, anthropologists, and neuroscientists have produced numerous studies demonstrating that humans possess biologically rooted psychological tendencies. These tendencies result in patterns of thought, emotion, and behavior which recur across different societies. Notably, such tendencies give rise to particular religious beliefs and moral values. Recent research on biologically rooted psychological tendencies is often labeled cognitive science or evolutionary psychology. Currently, there are very few cognitive science studies focus specifically on Islam, and those that exist offer limited and preliminary analyses of select topics. Nevertheless, general cognitive science scholarship addresses numerous subjects relevant to Islamic studies. For instance, there are studies on the biologically rooted psychological mechanisms underlying ritual, and these studies are relevant to the study of Islamic worship. There is scholarship on the biopsychological mechanisms underlying mystic experience, and these studies are relevant to the analysis of Sufism. There are studies on the mechanisms underlying the production and transmission of supernatural narrative, and these are relevant to the analysis of Islamic scripture. There are studies on the mechanisms underlying the learning and internalization of communal beliefs, and these are relevant to the study of traditional Islamic education. Within the cognitive science literature, one line of research is particularly important for Islamic studies. It holds that biologically rooted psychological mechanisms produce various intuitions. An intuition is an inclination to adopt a particular belief because it is perceived to be inherently plausible or correct. Such intuitions can be classified as religious, for instance, an intuition that the soul is immortal. There are also intuitions that can be classified as moral. So, for instance, an intuition that stealing is wrong. Psychological experiments establish that particular moral and religious intuitions spontaneously develop in young children, for instance, children 3 to 10 years of age. Beliefs based on such intuitions recur frequently, though not inevitably, in unconnected societies across the globe, as indicated by statistical compilations of anthropological research data. Studies further indicate that common forms of animal behavior may underlie human intuitions. So, for instance, many animals care for kin and avoid incest, and those behaviors are arguably related to human moral intuitions that one should care for kin and avoid incest. Scholars differ on how many distinct religious or moral intuitions exist, although there is significant evidence for somewhere between 3 and 6 religious intuitions and somewhere between 5 and 15 moral intuitions. Let us consider 3 well-evidenced religious intuitions. Thus, there is evidence that humans have an intuition that spirit beings exist. So a spirit being is an invisible being which possesses a mind but lacks a perceptible physical body. There is evidence that humans possess an intuition that a God exists. So God is a supremely powerful spirit being who created the universe with a purpose. There is evidence that humans have an intuition that the soul is immortal, such that there is life after death. These 3 intuitions have been incorporated into various religions, including Islam. Thus, Islam affirms various spirit beings like angels and jinn. It affirms a God, namely Allah, and it affirms life after death in Jannah or Jahannam. At the same time, Islam molds these intuitions into distinctive forms. For example, Islam denies that God takes avatars or incarnations, thereby endorsing a concept of God which differs from that found in Hinduism and Christianity. Similarly, Islam does not conceive of life after death in terms of reincarnation, thereby endorsing a concept of the afterlife which differs from that found in Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism. We may now shift gears and move from religious intuitions to moral intuitions. As with religious intuitions, it can be argued that these have been that moral intuitions have been incorporated into Islam, but have been molded into distinctive forms. Here I provide several brief examples drawn from Islamic law. First, humans have an intuition that dishonesty is wrong, such that one should not lie or violate oaths or promises. Accordingly, Islamic law forbids lying and lays down specific penalties for oath breaking. So, for instance, the oath breaker must feed or clothe 10 poor persons, and so on. Second, humans have an intuition that property rights exist and should be respected. Accordingly, Islamic law lays down specific penalties for theft, like the amputation of the hand. A third, humans have an intuition that it is morally good to care for kin and family. Accordingly, Islamic law requires that individuals provide regular financial support to their young children and needy parents, both in this life, and then after they die, they need to continue providing for them by allocating them specified inheritance shares. Fourth, humans naturally and unconsciously divide the world into communities defined by shared characteristics, whether those characteristics be blood, cultural practices, or religious practices. And humans have an intuition that it is morally good to protect one's community and its interests vis-a-vis other communities. So humans have an intuition that it is morally good to, humans also have an intuition that it is morally good to preserve one's community's distinctive way of life. Such intuitions underlie phenomena of tribalism, patriotism, and nationalism, as well as moral opposition to the biological or cultural genocide of one's people. Islamic law treats Muslims as a community or an ummah. Furthermore, it obliges individual Muslims to protect this community through jihad and to protect the community's Sharia-defined way of life through al-amr bil-ma'ruf wa nahy 'anil munkar. Now, conventional humanities scholarship recognizes that culture, including religion, shapes Muslim beliefs and norms. Culture is typically theorized in terms of transmitted conceptual frameworks or bodily practices imposed by powerful institutions. Nevertheless, while culture is an important factor, a more adequate view must account for biologically rooted psychology. Further work in Islamic studies should situate Islamic texts, artifacts, and buildings, practices, doctrines, and institutions in relationship to biologically rooted psychology. In this way, it will be possible to see how biologically rooted psychological tendencies shape various core elements of the Islamic tradition, including Islamic theology, Islamic law, Sufism, Islamic education, and Islamic art. Notably, the biologically rooted psychology of human beings can be statistically measured through surveys and experiments. For instance, suppose we wish to measure someone's moral intuition that an individual should care for kin. We could ask that person to rate on a scale of 1 to 10 how strongly they believe that individuals have a moral obligation to care for kin. Alternatively, we could also measure what percentage of that person's salary he or she gives to his or her family. Over the past 2 decades, it has been recognized that psychological attributes vary significantly between populations across the globe in statistically measurable ways. This realization has spurred efforts to systematically compile statistical data on the full range of psychological characteristic of different populations across the globe. For instance, psychological data has been compiled on attributes like religiosity, moral values, subjectively experienced happiness or well-being, analytic thinking tendencies, sexual or mating preferences, patterns in the expression of emotion. We can use the term psychological statistics to describe statistical data on the psychological attributes of different populations across the globe. Psychological statistics can be seen as a type of socioeconomic statistics, a topic to which we will now turn. So this relates to the third development that we find in the Western academic study of Islam and Muslim societies over the past 2 decades. So this development relates to data science and socioeconomic statistics. Conventional studies of Islam and Muslim societies are purely qualitative in character. Such studies usually rely on either textual analysis or ethnographic fieldwork. Nevertheless, qualitative data is often imprecise and vulnerable to the influence of political biases. Consequently, over the past 2 decades, scholars of Islam and Muslim societies have increasingly turned to quantitative statistical data. As will be explained, this shift is tied to the emergence of data science methods and technologies. There are myriad types of socioeconomic statistics. Some basic examples are life expectancy, fertility, marriage, divorce rates, gender equality, urbanization, education, literacy, economic growth, crime rate, frequency of political violence, and so on. As noted previously, psychological statistics can also be categorized as a type of socioeconomic statistics. Over the past 3 decades, it has increasingly been recognized that various types of socioeconomic statistics are related to one another in hidden ways. This has encouraged interdisciplinary research, which seeks to identify and mathematically describe patterns of mutual influence between different types of socioeconomic statistics or statistical variables. Such efforts give significant attention to religion. They also heavily rely on regression analysis and seek to answer questions of the following type. When the percentage of citizens who believe in God in a country increases by what point? What impact, what quantitative impact does this have on the country? What quantitative impact does it have on, let's say, the country's economic growth rate, or its rate of homicide, or its rate of patents per capita, which is a measure of innovation? Or, for instance, when citizens' average time in school increases by a year, what is the quantitative impact that has on the country's fertility rates, or on the citizens' level of happiness, or on the percentage of the population that believes in God, or on the percentage of the population that believes care for kin is an important moral value? Such interdisciplinary research has been spearheaded by economists working in the disciplines of behavioral economics and the economics of religion, but has also attracted political scientists, psychologists, sociologists, as well as quantitative-minded anthropologists and historians. The past 2 decades have also witnessed growing interdisciplinary interest in the compilation of comprehensive socioeconomic statistics on societies across the globe and throughout history. Comprehensive statistics enable scholars to describe long-term socioeconomic trends, extending back many hundreds of years, and in certain cases, many thousands of years. Efforts to compile comprehensive global historical socioeconomic statistics have produced extensive data on Muslim populations. Such data makes it possible to produce various instructive quantitative comparisons. Hence, it is possible to compare Muslim societies with non-Muslim societies. For instance, we can ask whether marriage patterns in Pakistan and Morocco differ from those found in the US and Brazil. We can also compare various Muslim societies to each other to see how they differ from one another. So for instance, how do Middle Eastern Muslim societies differ quantitatively from those found in Southeast Asia or Sub-Saharan Africa? Furthermore, statistical data makes it possible to detect historical changes in Muslim societies over time. So how does Muslim family size today compare with Muslim family size in the year 1900 or in the year 1000? Data also makes it possible to detect hidden statistical relationships at work in Muslim societies. So for instance, in Muslim societies, what is the impact of marriage rates or divorce rates on crime rates? Or how is gender equality related to economic growth? The aforementioned statistical literature on Muslim societies or emerging societies has revealed many notable trends. For instance, it seems like Muslim populations are quantitatively characterized by lower levels of homicide, lower levels of suicide, lower levels of alcohol use, and lower levels of both extramarital sex and HIV infection. Such figures suggest that Orthodox Islamic norms against practices such as homicide, suicide, alcohol, and extramarital sex actually have a real effect on human behavior. Particularly notable is Islam's status as the world's fastest growing religion. Thus, Muslims were 12.4% of the world's population in 1900, but doubled to 24.3% of the world's population in 2020, and are projected to reach 32% of the world's population in 2075, overtaking Christians as the world's largest religious group. Although the Muslim percentage share of the world's population is increasing, other major religious traditions like Christianity, Hinduism, and Buddhism have maintained relatively stable shares of the global population. And these shares have not significantly changed over the past 100 years. Muslims are growing faster than other religious communities, primarily due to higher fertility, i.e. number of children per woman. However, it is also due to higher levels of religiosity. Hence, fewer peoples leave Islam than the number which enter through conversion. And other major religious traditions, more people leave than convert, or the numbers balance out. As indicated above, increasing interest in quantitative data is directly tied to the emergence of new data science methods and technologies. Data science can be conceptualized as a blend of computer programming and statistical analysis. This blend is reflected at a simpler level in the use of programs like Microsoft Excel. It is represented at a more advanced level in the R programming language for statistical computing. This can be explained as follows. In order to work with large quantities of statistical data, this data must be organized in tabular form, in rectangular tables of rows and columns, like an Excel spreadsheet or an R data frame. For instance, suppose that one wants to see how religion affects social life in countries across the world. In order to do this, one must create a giant table containing different types of statistical data. In one column, one needs to list every country in the world. In the neighboring columns, one could list the dominant form of religiosity in each country. For instance, one could have a column on whether a particular country is Muslim, Christian, Hindu, atheist, and so on. In the other columns, one can list statistical data on topics like per capita GDP, homicide rate, marriage rate, lifespan, and average years of schooling. Once this table has been created, one can run different types of statistical analyses to determine relationships between variables and to represent these relationships in mathematical models and graphs. For instance, we might find that per capita GDP in a country is primarily determined by the average number of years its population spends in school. GDP, we could also determine that secondarily, per capita GDP is based on factors like whether the country is a democracy or, for instance, or factors related to the environment or related to the existence of natural resources. This information is useful for understanding relationships between these variables. But in reality, the approach that I've been describing has many further complexities, which I have not mentioned. For instance, building a massive table is no easy task. It usually requires combining smaller tables from a variety of sources. Moreover, such tables usually contain some number of errors or missing entries. Computer programming is important because it provides operations which enable us to combine and reorder tables, to clean these tables by fixing errors and missing entries. Computer programming also enables us to run statistical analyses using the new tables we have made. Programming enables us to visually represent our statistical findings in the form of scatter plots, box plots, bar graphs, and the like. This is why the rise of statistical analysis is closely related to the rise of data science. Further research on Islam and Muslim societies does not merely require scholars who are interested in paying attention to socioeconomic statistics generated by others. It also requires scholars with enough data science expertise to collect and analyze the relevant statistical information themselves. Okay, so this brings us to the fourth development in the study of Islam and Muslim societies, which pertains to data science and statistics on cultural products. So the emergence of data science technologies has not only facilitated the collection and analysis of statistical data on socioeconomic matters, it has also encouraged scholars to collect and analyze statistical data on cultural products, such as texts, images, audio clips, and video materials. This can be explained as follows. Ordinary cultural artifacts can be transformed into digital cultural artifacts saved as computer files. Thus, an ordinary text or photo can be scanned and transformed into a digital text or photo. Digital artifacts have two key advantages over ordinary artifacts. First, it is possible to collect and store an enormous number of digital artifacts on a computer. For instance, it would be difficult to compile together 1 million different books, ordinary books. But if you digitize those books, you can easily build a library on your computer that contains 1 million or 10 million versions of the book. A second advantage of digital artifacts is that they can be analyzed by a computer. So for instance, with ordinary printed text or with manuscripts, it's not possible to use a computer to analyze their contents. But once a book, once a text or a picture has been digitized, once you've made a copy of it, once you've scanned it into a computer, you can use computers to analyze it. So a computer can search out words or phrases in millions of digital texts. It can determine which words and phrases occur together. It can count these words and phrases. Similarly, a computer can search through millions of digital photos and classify them into different categories. At present, computer analysis of digital artifacts relies heavily on natural language processing, machine learning, and network analysis. The outwork of computer analysis largely consists in statistical outputs. So computers can visually represent statistical data about texts and pictures in a rich variety of ways, including graphs, tables, word clouds, network diagrams, and heat maps. Over the past 3 decades, a growing number of scholars have begun using computers to compile and analyze massive collections of cultural artifacts. These scholars come from a range of fields, including computer science, the natural sciences, the social sciences, and the humanities. Humanities work has given special attention to Islamic studies. The term digital humanities is usually used to describe this work. The past 10 years have witnessed the beginning of digital humanities scholarship in Islamic studies. Most of this scholarship comes from humanities specialists interested in computers. Some digital humanities scholarship in Islamic studies engages with visual materials like images of artifacts and buildings or maps. However, the overwhelming majority focuses on texts. Priority has been given to Arabic language texts. Thus, in pre-modern Muslim lands, Arabic was the language of scholarship, the primary language of scholarship, and was used by people of different linguistic and cultural backgrounds, similar to the case of English today. The Arabic textual tradition is one of the largest in human history. It is possible to identify over 40,000 unique titles within this tradition for the period before 1900. These titles cover every aspect of Islamic religion, culture, and history. Existing digital humanities scholarship is given special attention to classical religious texts. So for instance, texts of hadith, fiqh, tafsir. Digital humanities scholarship is also given special attention to texts which contain historical data on important Muslim persons, places, writing, and events. So these texts include biographical dictionaries, histories, bibliographies. At present, much digital humanities scholarship in Islamic studies centers on producing producing digital copies of Arabic Islamic texts from ordinary manuscripts, collecting together massive numbers of Arabic Islamic digital texts, checking over these digital texts for accuracy and completeness. Significant attention is also given to tagging digital texts. Tags can be used to identify a given text's author, date of composition, geographical origin, and genre. Tags can also be used to identify different chapter sections and subsections within the text, so a kitab or a bab or a fasl. Complex tagging enables complex forms of computerized statistical analysis. For instance, absent tagging, one can answer a question like the following: how much attention measured in word count do Islamic legal texts give to specific topics, like let's say ablution or divorce or jihad? By adding tags on a text's date of composition and geographical origin, one gains the ability to ask questions which are related to matters of time and geography. So for instance, one can say, once one has marked every text, tagged every text, such that that text is identified by its geographic origin and its historical time period, we can ask, for instance, what percentage of Islamic texts were generated by different regions in the Muslim world. So for instance, how many texts were generated historically in India or Central Asia as opposed to Syria? We can also ask questions like, how did the scholarly productivity of different regions change over time? This type of scholarship provides insight into a particularly important Islamic studies questions. What were the most influential persons or texts in particular regions and at particular historical moments? So for instance, in different eras of Islamic history, which texts are being cited the most often and which authors are being cited the most often? This question of which texts and which authors are being cited the most often, which are being quoted the most often, will fundamentally affect how we view the entire Islamic tradition, because this will help give us a better idea of which scholars were considered in the pre-modern period to be the most important scholars, which texts were considered to be the most important texts. Of course, people have ideas about this in the present, that particular scholars or particular texts were fundamental to the Islamic tradition. But one of the things about the modern period is in the modern period, some thinkers who were less important in the pre-modern period, or at the very least controversial, have come to be viewed as more important over the past couple of hundred years. So for instance, a figure like Ash-Shatibi or Ibn Taymiyyah. One of the questions that we should ask, though, is in the pre-modern period, which figures or which texts were considered to be the most important? How did this change over time, and how did this vary by region? And this is something which requires a quantitative analysis of texts. We can also talk about how statistics related to cultural artifacts like texts can be related to socioeconomic statistics or socioeconomic trends. And here you have different types of methods that are used. One of the most important tools that is used for this type of analysis today is the Google Engram viewer. This viewer has access to millions of digital books written in particular languages over particular time periods. This tool allows users to track historical variations in word frequencies over time. It is recognized that specific words that occur in texts are linked to particular religious and moral values, often religious and moral values which have a psychological basis to them. Shifts in word frequency during a particular period indicate shifts related to religion and morality during that time period. Furthermore, such shifts may be correlated with socioeconomic shifts occurring during those periods. For instance, suppose that English books mention God and adultery less after the year 1850. This may indicate that religion and family are valued less in an English context in English-speaking countries. And this shift can be tied to different socioeconomic shifts. So maybe we see from texts written in English that the words God or the word adultery occur less. This indicates less emphasis on religion or family values. And maybe that those shifts can be tied to, let's say, higher levels of urbanization or a greater number of years spent in school. So in this way, we can link statistical shifts that we find in texts related to word frequency to socioeconomic shifts that are occurring outside of those texts. Now, just as this is possible with respect to English language texts, it is possible with respect to Chinese texts and Arabic language texts, although at least at the present, the tool known as the Engram viewer doesn't have an Arabic option. Okay. I have listed 4 developments which have begun to transform the academic study of Islam and Muslim societies over the past 20 years. To recapitulate, the first development includes efforts to provide a new account of early Islamic history based on a much wider range of evidentiary sources like rock inscriptions from across Arabia, Greek, Syriac, and Pahlavi texts, as well as archaeological and bioarchaeological discoveries. The second development I've mentioned consists in the use of cognitive science to understand the biologically rooted psychological foundations of Muslim religiosity and social behavior more generally. The third development consists in the use of data science and socioeconomic statistics to understand Muslim societies. The fourth development consists in the use of data science to understand Muslim cultural artifacts like texts, but also photos, videos, and the like. In fact, these four developments are not really separate. Rather, there are increasing efforts to integrate these developments. For instance, using data science methods, studies analyze Muslim societies with reference to both socioeconomic statistics and statistics on Muslim cultural artifacts, like text statistics. Furthermore, this can be done for all periods in Muslim history. The statistical analysis can be used to deepen our knowledge of early Islam and early Islamic cultural artifacts, such as the Quran and Hadith. Moreover, statistical analysis of all types is increasingly situated in relationship to human biopsychological tendencies. For instance, religion and morality have biopsychological foundations. Consequently, statistics which indicate changes in a population's religious and moral views also indicate that this population has undergone a psychological transformation. And this transformation can be explained with reference to biologically rooted psychological mechanisms. Societies which are best positioned to contribute to further debates on Islam and Muslim societies should familiarize themselves with these recent developments in scholarship. Moreover, they must master skills and technologies related to these types of developments. Muslim academic institutions which adapt themselves to these changes will be able to position themselves as leaders. Okay, so I will end on that note. That is 45 minutes, so I will stop there. Sure.
Thank you very much, Dr. Aria, for this excellent overview on the development and studies of Islam and Muslim societies for the past 2 decades. I believe personally that this might be a kind of a roadmap for the future studies for people who are working on studying Islam and Muslim society for the coming decades, inshallah. Now I will try to take questions. First, I will start by the question posted by Dr. Imtiaz. He is referring to the discovery of the Birmingham Quran, and he is asking any recorded differences between the Osman version of the Quran, which is kept in many places, and the one which discovered in the Birmingham one. And he is commenting because he knew one of the professors there, Professor David Thomas. He said that he raised few criticism, and he's commenting also, Dr. Imtiaz, that actually the Birmingham text is not complete. It's not the whole Quran. It's only a few surahs. So I'll start with this question.
Yeah, so the Birmingham manuscript is not the entirety of the Quran. Usually, though, when we talk about manuscripts, so for instance, before one can find, let's say, an entire copy of the New Testament or an entire copy of the Hebrew Bible, one begins by finding these different scraps and pieces. To my knowledge, nothing, whether we're talking about the Birmingham manuscript or whether we're talking about other fragments that have been found or other pages that have been found, these are texts that do not have any significant difference with the consonantal skeleton that are found in the Orthomanic text. Now, I know that many people may think, well, it's not very surprising that, or it's not very, or they might say simply finding a couple pages in the Birmingham manuscript or finding these other Quranic texts from the first 100 years or the first 200 years are not significant finds. Of course, in the Muslim world, it was always assumed that the Quran had been transmitted faithfully. However, this is in terms of historically establishing that point, that point has become kind of an issue of major controversy. And it's easier to understand why when we go ahead and we look at the at every other major religious tradition. So whether we're talking about, so the notion that, for instance, you could have a copy, that you could even have one page of, let's say, the Pentateuch of the Old Testament traceable to Moses. This is just, something which is impossible to imagine for Western scholars. Similar, the notion that you could go ahead and have material which is transmittable to, let's say, the Buddha or Lao Tzu. We simply don't have texts of this type that exist, even in fragmentary form. We have stuff that comes centuries later, but that stuff that comes centuries later, it can always be, in every single tradition, it is always claimed that these texts have been transmitted kind of in a faithful, unchanged manner. But the question is, how do you respond to the criticism that they haven't? And something like the Birmingham manuscript, even though it doesn't include the entire Quran, it severely undermines claims that, let's say, the Quranic text evolved over 100 to 200 years. And it certainly, even if we were only concerned with the pages, with the number of pages that were found in the Birmingham manuscript, there's no other major religious text that has been preserved in that way. And that's important not only for the Quranic text itself, but it indicates that the Muslims from the earliest period did make efforts and were successful and undertook various projects to preserve their religious traditions in a way that is quite exceptional. So I hope that somewhat answers the question. It's a great question, and these archaeological issues are very interesting, but to discuss them in more depth would require kind of a very long period.
Okay. I have another question. I'm trying to check questions. Sometimes some come to me also on my phone through WhatsApp. Another question is actually for Dr. Aria, is who can be considered now leading researcher in some of these directions in the West or in the East? Are there any institutes or persons who are considered leading in these directions of the study of Islam and Muslim societies? Huh? No, but
I mean, one can think of a variety of figures. So some of these developments are newer than others, but if it were to, for instance, collecting together, let's say, the different types of evidence, a good example would be Robert Hoyland, who's at NYU. He would be considered, for instance, a leading figure who is doing that. A leading figure in the compilation of socioeconomic statistics about the Muslim world. I mean, this is a figure who, in all honesty, has some very critical things to say about the Muslim world, but is nevertheless a leading figure. This is Timur Quran of Duke University. So he's kind of an economist and a political scientist. In terms of people who are doing cognitive science and Muslim societies, there's a lot of cognitive science that is on human religiosity generally and comments on Muslim societies, among others. Kind of some leading figures there are Joseph Heinrich and Ara Norenzian. But if someone were to talk about an entire book written on cognitive science as it relates to Muslim societies, there has been a book on that, but it specifically focuses on the topic of jihad. That's by Scott Atran. So that would be an example of that. In terms of digital humanities scholarship on the Muslim world, let me see. A name that comes to mind is, just want to make sure I'm pronouncing this correctly. So, I mean, one person who has done some very important work in digital humanities scholarship in the Muslim world is Maxim Romanov. I think, or I'm looking right now, I think he's at University of Vienna. So those would be some examples, but these are recent developments. Oftentimes, what you have is general development. So generally speaking, it's not that work on, let's say, cognitive science or data science and socioeconomic statistics or data science and textual analysis, that the people who came up with this were specifically specialists in Islam. These are larger trends which are reshaping all of Western academia. And they're reshaping all of Western academia is because they have implications for all different types of topics. So these changes are not simply reshaping the study of Islam. They're reshaping, let's say, the study of Christianity. They're reshaping the study of Judaism. They're reshaping the study of, let's say, art. They're art in China. I mean, you have kind of, let's say, digital humanities scholarship on that. So, I mean, these are broader fundamental changes in the production of knowledge that you find in Western universities. And right now, the basic building blocks have been put in place in terms of the technologies, in terms of the methods. And right now, we're just asking, what are the specific implications for Islamic studies? So let's say someone comes up, like an example is David Reich. So David Reich is a very famous scholar. He's at Harvard, and he has come up with certain methods and findings related to paleogenetics. So how do you take DNA from bones and use that to determine things like migrations of past populations, their mating patterns, forms of inequality, other aspects of their life. So he has gone ahead and produced this data and is then using it to analyze all of these different Muslim populations, all these different populations across the globe, some of which are Muslim populations. But in the future, people can use and apply these same methods to go ahead and ask questions about Muslim history. These general methods to apply them in more depth and ask questions about Muslim history. So that is where we're really at this present moment. The general changes are occurring, and they're starting to affect scholarship on Islam in the Muslim world, but we're still in the early phases of that.
There are two other questions I received in the chat. Of course, one question is not directly because Dr. Aria is not specializing in the Jewish history, but it is related to Mr. Razi is asking. There is a kind of a discrepancy between the historical narration that Nabi Sulaiman was a king and his empire was much more bigger even than the British Empire. And at the same time, people now restricting the place of the kingdom of Sulaiman to a small part of Palestine. So he's asking about this discrepancy and the archaeological issues related to it. So if you want to comment on this.
I mean, this is a good point. This is, for instance, especially when it comes to the first development, which is the integration of sources beyond Arabic texts into Islamic history. This is something that has older precedents in, let's say, the study of the Hebrew Bible. So, for instance, if someone were to study Jewish history or early Jewish history, they wouldn't just study texts, Hebrew texts that are written by Jews. Archaeology plays an extremely important role in the study of the Hebrew Bible. And also the study of other languages also plays an very important role in studying early Jewish history. So for instance, studying Babylonian texts, for instance, studying ancient Egyptian texts and monuments. And now when it comes to the specific issue of the archaeology of Jerusalem or the archaeology of Solomon's kingdom, this is one of the issues where such work can lead to situations where there are discrepancies between certain claims that are made in texts and what is available exclusively through the scientific or historical method. I think in any religion, whether it's Judaism or Islam, to some extent, you have things that are based on scientific and historical methods, or which can be confirmed through scientific and historical methods. But to some extent, you have things which are based on trust in the text and on a belief. So for instance, scientific and historical methods cannot establish that Moses existed. The reason why Muslims believe that Moses existed is because he's mentioned and discussed in the Quran. And this same principle might apply to some other issues. So there may be certain issues that you cannot confirm through scientific and historical methods, or there may be some kind of, there may be certain possible discrepancies, but this is kind of not a new issue. And the belief of any religion, including Islam, is not strictly based on science. Otherwise, you'd have, for instance, issues accepting miracles and other events as well. So I hope that's something of an answer to that question.
Okay, because
Okay, go ahead.
another question also, this one I think is simple, quick. Mr. Nauman asking whether we should keep or people are not keeping the title in the West for people studying Islam and Islamic studies as Orientalists. Now change it to be scholars of Islamic studies. Is this a shift or just to avoid the negative impression and context of being Orientalist?
I mean, I think it is to some extent. I mean, I do think certain changes have occurred. It's recognized that Orientalism was very much tied to a colonialist project and endorsed certain claims about Muslim societies in order to justify kind of the colonial domination of those societies. I think that there's more consciousness of this, and there's an attempt to ensure that those political factors don't guide Muslim scholarship. Has that been successful? To some extent, yes, but to some extent, no. Although I would say that there are really some different branches of Islamic studies. So those branches of Islamic studies that are the most politicized actually have to deal with things like deal with the kind of the qualitative analysis of Muslim texts. So for instance, one of the things that you get in one trend that you get in Western academia even to this day is kind of an attempt to show that Islamic texts or the Islamic tradition is really consistent with Islam, with evolving Western values, and to critique other views of those texts. So that is kind of politicized element of Islamic scholarship that exists to this day. But one reason why some scholars are more interested in statistical data or in bioarchaeological data is because even though it can be manipulated for political ends, it's not as easy to manipulate as purely qualitative data.
I have from one viewer, Mr. Bakri, 3 questions. So I will start by, maybe I will mention all of them because I think all of them are quite, might be straightforward. Number 1, he is asking about, is there any substantial differences between the Osman version of the Quran and the Birmingham version which were discovered? And then The second question is about cognitive science. And he's saying that there have been a kind of a stereotype. I'm trying to summarize the question and somehow. Stereotype that Oriental versus Western brain, or what some people call pink versus blue brain. And are you suggesting that we should now consider something we can call it Islamic brain?
I'm sorry, I don't quite understand.
He is saying that the neuroscience, cognitive science studies have been always talking about the Oriental versus the Western brain. And the pink versus blue brain. So he's saying, are you suggesting that we should have something called an Islamic brain? This is the second question. The third question, the last one, can you comment on the environment, in particular climate, where the extremes of desert climate give rise to monotheism, while faiths like Buddhism arising in the tropical area with dead trees, grow, fungi, and this type of things. There is a fourth question actually now.
Okay, so these are three great questions. First, let me say with respect to that, so to my knowledge, there are no significant differences between the Birmingham Quran manuscript and the Continental text of the Orthomanic Codex. Although I should say that in terms of the type of discoveries that are being made, I mentioned the Birmingham manuscript simply because it's an early one, but there are many manuscript discoveries. So there are dozens, if not more, of manuscripts which have been discovered, early manuscripts which have been discovered. So the reason why I picked that one is simply because it's widely considered to be the earliest, but there are many that one could mention. With respect to the question of different types of brains, perhaps when there's a mention of a blue brain and a pink brain, maybe, or a blue brain and a pink brain, that might be difference of gender. And then the notion of an Eastern brain versus a Western brain, that's obviously relevant to culture. So is there a Muslim brain? There's a lot of evidence which indicates that there is actually a Muslim brain. So people can go ahead and the way that you establish that is you establish it through psychological statistics. So for instance, in Muslim populations, there are higher levels of religiosity than other populations. The Muslim populations are uniquely religious. Muslim populations have among the highest, if not the highest, moral value that they place on family life as opposed to individualism, as opposed to, let's say, individual liberty. You have a variety, so those are just kind of two examples of how Muslim societies across, and this is something which is found in Muslim societies across the world, how Muslims have certain statistically measurable psychological differences, and those are reflected in statistically measurable social behaviors, like, let's say, a high level of marriage or a low level of sexually transmitted diseases. So I would say, so a lot of people would say it's not, but there's not only an Eastern brain and a Western brain or a Muslim brain, but in fact, for instance, the psychology of people in China is very different from that of the people in the West. Which is, and both of them are very different from the psychology of Muslim populations. So in fact, there are many, many different psychologies that you find in the world. And it's difficult to talk about those psychologies or compare them in a precise way without the compilation of statistics. But this is in fact one of the reasons why people are trying to compile these statistics on the psychology of different populations across the world and seeing how these statistics can be correlated with other types of socioeconomic statistical differences. With respect to the blue brain and the pink brain, so should the notion that there are biologically rooted gender differences be considered by scholars of Muslim societies? think that this is reasonable to do. I mean, people in many different disciplines are saying that there are biological differences between men and women, and those should be taken into account in going ahead and examining human social behavior in any society, including Muslim societies. Okay, do societies which are pastoral, or do societies in desert areas have more of a tendency to monotheism, whereas societies in kind of tropical areas have a tendency more towards polytheism? So of course we can think of examples. So someone would say, okay, well, the Abrahamic traditions are monotheistic, and they come from the Middle East, which is an arid area. Meanwhile, you have the Indian subcontinent, and that is tied to maybe certain polytheistic traditions. But so first of all, this issue would have to be measured carefully. So I understand that there are grounds to make this claim that this pattern exists, but one would have to compile actual data, I think, on the different religions which have emerged in different regions over time, and see if one can find a correlation between, let's say, populations that subscribe to a particular religion, whether it's monotheistic or polytheistic, and the environment. To my knowledge, there's no evidence which relates to aridity or whether a society is arid or tropical, but there is a correlation between subsistence structure. So whether a society is a hunter-gatherer society, a pastoral society, an agricultural society. Overall, hunter-gatherer societies are more polytheistic and animistic than agricultural or pastoral societies. And pastoral societies in particular have a tendency towards monotheism.
Okay, thank you much. Thank you much, Dr. Aria. I think the time is flying, so I will not be able to entertain other questions. I will give now the mic to the Dean, Professor Abdulaziz Barghoud, to have closing remarks for this talk.
Yes, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. First of all, let me thank Dr. Aria for first being our visiting guest speaker in Stack here, and this is his first lecture, and we will be having, inshallah, the second lecture on the 6th of July. And I would like to thank all the people who are following us here in the Zoom and the YouTube channel. And I have just some comments and one question to Dr. Aria. I think what you have presented to us is really important as far as the Islamic studies articulation, teaching is concerned, especially during this time, and all the things that are happening in the world globally. So I really thank you for bringing up this topic. The lecture was very rich, a lot of ideas and many things to learn, and I see that maybe many of us in certain countries and contexts, maybe we are not really familiar with this approach of how we articulate and look at the Islamic studies and the religion of Islam and its contribution in the development of societies. If you look at the classical way, or even the current way of how we teach Islamic studies, whether theology or fiqh and usul or aqidah, we follow the normal way and approaches of delivery which we learn from our tradition. But here you are bringing this, the use of data, the use of this skills and strategies and approaches to deal with Islamic studies. The statistical approaches may open more avenue and opportunities for us to see the impact and more applications of Islam, Islamic worldview, Islamic studies into the societal development. I think that's what he wanted to tell us today. And also, this one from the data perspective, the statistical perspective, and I can take it bigger. Maybe in the future, we need to start thinking on how artificial intelligence can influence the understanding and teaching of Islamic studies in our context. So I think you have given us this example of how data and statistics can be used really to teach effectively, efficiently the Islamic studies for impact into the society. I think also when you brought the idea of the cognitive and the psychological sciences, cognitive sciences, all this I think also archaeology and so on and so forth means we are trying to talk about this multi or transdisciplinary approaches to the way how we look at the Islamic studies. That's one comment. The second one, I think, based on what you have mentioned to us here, I don't know what will be your view on the next kind of preparation, like teacher preparation of Islamic studies in the future. Means what kind of skills, strategies, approaches, knowledge, cognitive, affective, psychomotor, all these things for the professors, for the teachers of Islamic studies in the future. How do you convince the new reader, the new learner of Islamic studies in the future, where all these things are really now dominating little by little? So that's my first question is, what is your view of the type of training Islamic studies professors, lecturers, even students, postgraduate need in the now and in the future in order really to deal with this type of knowledge creation, as you said, in this context of Islamic studies. The last thing is, as you know, Dr. Aria, these things which you mentioned are, as you said rightly, some new trends in the Western context. And you know, the Islamic context has its own dynamics, its own natures, the natures of the Muslim mind in the Muslim society. And the Muslim culture, the psychology, the feelings about Islam, about religion, about the figures, about Rasul, about ulama, about Sahaba. All these things I think will have many bearings when we come and try to implement Western models or ways in our context. I think it will be better if we try to understand those dynamics, those things which are happening there, and try to articulate, taking into account our own psychosocial context and way of looking at to the Islamic studies and their impacts. Saying this because I think there is a long way to go to reach this level or stage of approaching Islamic studies and looking at them from this perspective. And I think being also a Muslim and you are familiar with Islamic society, you would know that in many classical institutions of Islamic studies, we are still actually in a stage where I think I don't see that many of us use this transdisciplinary or multidisciplinary approach and use all these multi-skills, multi-approaches to deal with. Still, we are in the textual analysis, doing induction, deduction, doing all these type of things, but bringing these cognitive sciences and neurosciences and data sciences and statistical sciences, it will need us, I think, some time to articulate. This is what is next. Means what is your advice on moving forward, but taking into account our own socio-cultural and formula of the mind itself. Go ahead.
Well, first of all, I think that you bring up some really great points. I think that one of the things which will always define anything that could be called an authentic continuation of a traditional Islamic education, a traditional Islamic culture, means mastering particular texts and also being initiated into certain practices like traditional madrasa had kind of an ethical component to it as well. So I think that any type of Islamic education, the point would not be to produce a situation where people don't study traditional texts or people don't live in accordance with certain values and practices tied to those texts. The question would be, when you have Muslims who are confronting the world, which is changing in particular ways, and where you have a lot of people using findings from these methods to critique Muslims and critique Muslims in a public, or to comment on Muslim societies or the Islamic tradition. So let's say hypothetically, you have a bunch of people and they say, well, you know what, I'm not interested in things like archaeological data, or I'm not interested in things like bioarchaeology. There are going to be people, some of them more objective academic types, some of them with a polemical agenda, who are going to use this and who are going to maybe take parts of it to go ahead and advance particular political aims. Maybe they're going to say, well, due to discovery X, Y, and Z, you know, all of this stuff in the Islamic tradition perhaps is not historically accurate, or it's not transmitted accurately. So, I mean, these are the kind of issues that emerge. The question is, when Muslims face criticisms of that type, do they have the tools to respond in a compelling and informed fashion to these types of issues? Well, let's say you have a situation where people say Muslim countries are failures, they have so much crime, they have so much terrorism. Someone might ask, where's the data on this terrorism that's found in all these Muslim societies, or all this violence that's found in all these Muslim societies? One might say, to the extent that you have terrorism in Muslim societies, maybe it's correlated with things like foreign invasion, for instance. Maybe it's correlated with things like sanctions. Maybe you have other countries in the Muslim world and they read and study Islamic texts all the time. They have a very high level of religiosity, but there's not this type of terrorism, precisely because there isn't this type of, there aren't these military invasions or sanctions. But that's something that you could prove through socioeconomic statistics. You could say this particular country has a very high level of religious practice. It has a high density of madrasas, but it's not experiencing these type of problems. Moreover, when people you might point out, in fact, when you look at Muslim societies, the homicide rates in Muslim societies are lower than you have in other societies with comparable levels of economic development. So here you have, in this situation, you need a mastery of this type of data in order to participate in global debates that are happening about the future of the world and the future of the Muslim world. So if I were going to try and convince someone of a traditional Islamic studies background to take into account some of these issues, I would say, how are you going to defend or even understand your tradition if you are not equipped to address the type of arguments that people are making about the historicity of the Islamic, the historicity of the Quran, the historicity of the Hadith, all of these various claims about purported dysfunctions or problems that characterize Muslim societies or that are supposedly correlated with Islam? How are you going to respond to these situations if you don't have those skills? And I think many people could and many people are recognizing that they need those skills to participate in these discussions in an informed fashion. Now, what kind of changes would need to be made to a curriculum? Once again, I don't think you could ever get rid of the practices, the traditional religious practices, or the mastery of these textual traditions, and experts in these textual traditions and qualitative forms of analysis. It's never to say that you should have a Muslim institution of learning which doesn't have those things as a central component. The only question is, should you have a institution of learning which completely lacks a substantial commitment to data science and statistical analysis as it pertains to the study of the Islamic tradition in Muslim societies? Is that justifiable? Is it justifiable to have an institution where there's no attention paid to the biological or psychological foundation of Muslim religiosity, of Muslim morality, of Muslim mating pattern, like marriage, for instance, marriage or mating and relations as a biological phenomenon, a family as a biological phenomenon? Is that justifiable? And I think I would say that it's difficult to justify. It's difficult to justify a Muslim institution that wants to be a leader for Muslims across the world and which ignores these types of knowledge.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Aria. I think it was a very fruitful discussion, and because of the time, we are exceeding our time, so I have to call to close the lecture today. I would like to thank all the people who have been with us on Zoom and on YouTube. And I would like to thank all people who contributed by questions and comments. Also, it was quite rich. And definitely thank you to Dr. Aria. It's a very provoking lecture. And I think, as I mentioned, it will have an impact on the future of Islamic studies and also the studies of Muslim society. Thank you very much for all of you. And we hope to see you in another lecture soon, inshallah. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.